Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive on OxyContin,
Oh, yeah.
based on an episode of the American Scandal podcast.
Okay.
And we really want to kind of figure out, how this supposedly revolutionary painkiller
Right.
became, one of the main things that contributed to the whole opioid crisis.
Hmm.
And it all really starts with a really sad event.
Yeah.
The death of Eddie Bish Jr. in 2001 from an overdose.
Wow.
And it was actually his dad who ended up kind of starting to uncover the truth about what was going on with this so-called miracle drug.
Yeah, it's really a story that kind of goes back to the 80s
Okay.
and the ambitions of this guy, Richard Sackler,
Mm-hmm.
the heir to the Purdue Frederick Company.
Oh, okay.
And, they were known for simple products back then.
Like what?
Laxative, stuff like that.
Okay.
But Richard, he wanted more. He wanted to make a, groundbreaking medication.
Yeah.
Like a legacy,
Right. Like every entrepreneur kind of wants to make the next big thing. But it sounds like Purdue had a little bit of a challenge. Their top seller, OxyContin,
Yeah.
was about to lose its patent.
Exactly. Huge problem.
Yeah, and they really needed something to replace it.
They needed that revenue, right?
Of course.
That's when Richard's cousin, Kathy Sackler,
Okay.
she suggested looking into oxycodone.
Okay.
And that's a powerful opioid.
Mm-hmm.
And research had shown that it could be really effective in high doses,
Okay.
especially if you combine it with this time release thing.
Interesting.
And that really led to the creation of OxyContin,
Okay.
basically combining oxycodone with Purdue's existing time release technology, which they called Contin.
I'm curious, how does that time release tech actually work?
Oh, yeah. So basically you have this 20 capsule
Okay.
with the medication inside.
Hmm.
And it's designed to release the drug slowly over time.
So it's not like a...
Not all at once.
Okay.
In this case, over 12 hours.
Okay.
So they thought this would give people long-lasting pain relief, but also reduce the potential for addiction.
Okay. So because it's not
Exactly. No sudden rush.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So they were hoping this would kind of overcome the hesitancy that doctors had about prescribing opioids.
Totally.
Because, they can be pretty strong.
Yeah. It was all about making doctors comfortable. Their marketing team, led by Michael Friedman,
Okay.
they had this challenge to make a campaign that presented OxyContin as safer and less addictive than other opioids out there.
But wasn't oxycodone actually stronger than morphine?
It is, yeah.
How did they get around that?
Well, a lot of people thought that oxycodone was weaker,
Really?
even though it's actually twice as potent as morphine.
Wow.
So Friedman, he used this to their advantage.
Interesting.
They marketed OxyContin as gentler, friendlier,
Okay.
all because of that time release formula.
So they had their narrative.
Yeah.
They had what they thought was a miracle drug
Mm-hmm.
and this time release tech.
Right.
So next up was the FDA.
The big hurdle. And Richard Sackler, he was determined to get broad approval.
Not just for specific cases.
Right, not just cancer patients, which is how it normally was for strong opioids.
Right.
And so Purdue actually worked to build relationships with FDA regulators.
To try to make the process go smoother.
Exactly.
Okay, now for those of us who don't really know much about pharmaceuticals and stuff,
Yeah.
can you explain what a package insert is?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And why the language that Purdue used was so important?
Yeah. So the package insert is basically like the instructions.
Oh,
It tells you about the dosage, side effects, warnings, all that.
okay.
And Purdue, they chose their words very carefully to downplay the addiction risks.
So what were they saying?
They'd use phrases like, "Deleve absorption is believed to reduce the abuse liability."
Okay.
Believed to reduce, you see.
It sounds like they were being very careful with their words.
Very.
Were there any people within the FDA that pushed back?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Did anyone question?
There's been a lot of debate about whether the FDA did enough.
Okay.
Some people say they were understaffed,
Mhm.
overwhelmed,
Yeah.
and that made them easier to influence.
Okay.
Others point to a cultural shift.
Where people were more willing to overlook these red flags.
Yeah, there was this big emphasis on treating pain aggressively back then.
Okay.
So maybe that contributed.
So OxyContin got approved,
Dude,
and Richard Sackler gave a speech to his sales force.
big celebration.
Yeah, sounds like he was really set on making this the top painkiller in the country.
He wanted to make it a blockbuster.
But why was that so important to him?
Well, profit was a big part of it,
Of course.
but it was more than that.
Okay.
He wanted to change Purdue's image.
Hmm.
They were known for boring products.
Right. Laxatives.
Veggie. He wanted them to be seen as innovators,
Okay.
leaders in the
To
industry.
kind of leave a mark.
Exactly.
So they had the drug approved. The marketing was ready to go.
All set.
And the sales force was ready in.
They were going to hit the ground running.
What happened next?
They launched this huge sales strategy.
Okay.
They sent reps all over the country to target doctors.
Okay.
And they were all about OxyContin's safety and how well it worked.
Can you get an example of what that sales pitch was like?
Oh, yeah. Think free meals for doctors.
Okay.
Seminars, all expenses paid.
Okay.
And tons of marketing materials that downplayed the risks.
Wow.
One tactic they used was to cite this article in the New England Journal of Medicine.
Okay.
Very prestigious.
Yeah.
But it was misleading.
What did it say?
It suggested that addiction rates for opioids were low.
Interesting.
And they use research and personal stories to try to calm doctors' worries about prescribing opioids.
It's kind of scary to think how many doctors fell for that.
Yeah.
Especially knowing now that it wasn't as safe as they said.
Right.
Were there any signs early on that things weren't as good as they seemed?
There were, actually.
Right.
The general counsel for Purdue, Howard Udell, he found online discussions about how to get around the time release.
To get a stronger high.
Exactly.
So people were already abusing it.
Yeah, and that went against everything Purdue was saying about how safe it was.
So Purdue knew about this.
They did.
What'd they do?
Well, Udell was worried about lawsuits,
Mm-hmm.
so he went into damage control.
Okay.
He told the sales reps to not write down any negative reports,
Really?
to just use phone calls instead.
So there wouldn't be a paper trail.
Right.
Wow.
And he also set up systems to destroy documents and emails.
To cover their tracks.
Exactly.
Sound like they were more worried about protecting themselves
Yeah.
than the harm it was causing.
It seems that way.
So by the late 90s,
Yeah.
OxyContin was a huge success.
Huge.
But it feels like that's also when the opioid crisis really started.
It did.
What happened next as all these warning signs started to get louder?
Well, we'll have to dive into that in part 2.
Sounds good. We'll be right back. As OxyContin just got more and more popular, we started to see the dark side of it too.
Right.
This is the late 90s now,
Yep.
and things are starting to shift a little.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about Purdue's boardrooms anymore.
Uh-huh.
We're hearing about real people's experiences.
Absolutely.
And one of those people is Dr. Art Van Zee.
Oh, yeah.
He was a doctor in a small mining town in Virginia,
Okay.
and he starts seeing this troubling trend among his patients
A lot of them relied on OxyContin.
for pain relief.
Yeah, exactly. Chronic pain.
So I imagine this was totally different from what Purdue was
It
saying.
was a huge contrast.
What was he actually seeing?
His patients weren't getting better.
Okay.
A lot of them were showing signs of addiction,
Really?
struggling with withdrawal,
Wow.
even doing desperate things to get more OxyContin.
So much for that less than 1% addiction rate.
Right. It was nowhere near that.
It sounds like he was one of the first to see how bad it could get.
He was definitely ahead of the curve.
What did he do?
He tried to warn people. He reached out to the FDA, the DEA, even Purdue.
Really?
He was really concerned about what he was seeing.
I can't even imagine how frustrating that must have been,
It was.
seeing this firsthand and trying to warn people.
And nobody listened.
Did anyone take him seriously?
Not really. They brushed him off.
Like they didn't believe him?
They said it was just anecdotal.
Or just a few isolated cases?
Yeah,
This just shows how they failed to see the bigger picture.
they missed it completely.
Do you think Purdue had something to do with that?
Maybe. They were really powerful.
Okay.
They'd spent a lot of money to build relationships and control the narrative.
It's like they made it taboo to question OxyContin.
Exactly. And there was also this stigma around addiction.
So it was easier to blame the individual,
Right. They saw it as a personal failing.
not a systemic issue.
Yeah.
So while Dr. Van Zee is trying to warn people,
Yeah.
Purdue's just pushing their narrative.
Even as people were overdosing,
Wow.
they kept saying that it was safe if you used it correctly.
So they were blaming the patients
Pretty much.
for getting addicted.
They didn't want to admit that the drug itself was addictive.
Did they do anything to silence these critics?
They hired a PR firm.
To control what the media was saying?
Exactly. They wanted to shape the narrative.
And discredit anyone who spoke out?
They called them alarmists.
Wow.
They were exaggerating.
So they were deflecting responsibility.
Completely.
But the truth always comes out eventually.
It does.
And as more people got addicted,
And more people overdosed.
Purdue's story started to unravel.
The cracks were showing.
And law enforcement started paying attention.
They did.
They started investigating Purdue's marketing.
Yeah. And all the crime related to OxyContin.
So it wasn't just individual cases anymore.
Right. It was a system-wide problem.
Then Purdue was right at the center of it.
They were.
And then came the lawsuits.
The big one was the Bill County lawsuit.
They were accused of misleading people about the risks.
Doctors and patients.
It became clear that they were all about profit.
No matter the cost.
These lawsuits must have been huge in exposing what Purdue did.
They were.
What kind of evidence came out?
Internal documents.
Okay.
Showing that Purdue knew how addictive it was.
Even though they were saying it was safe.
Exactly. They were lying.
They got caught in their own lies.
They did.
And now they were facing the consequences.
Yeah, it was all coming back to them.
And while all this is happening, people are dying.
The opioid crisis was getting worse.
So Purdue's at a crossroads.
They had a choice to make.
Keep fighting and denying everything.
Or try to fix things.
What did they do?
Well, we'll find out in part 3.
So Purdue's facing all this evidence and public anger about their role in the opioid crisis.
Yeah.
Did they finally admit they messed up?
Well, not really.
What did they do?
They went into damage control mode.
Instead of denying everything?
Yeah, they had too much evidence against them.
So what did they do?
They started making settlements.
To avoid bigger problems?
Yeah, they wanted to lessen the legal and financial fallout.
So basically they tried to pay their way out of it.
Kinda.
Did it work?
Well, they paid a lot of money.
But...
They usually got to plead guilty to misleading the public.
About how addictive it was.
Right.
But no one went to jail.
No executives faced criminal charges.
So it wasn't really justice.
It felt like a slap on the wrist to a lot of people.
Considering all the damage they caused.
Yeah, people were suffering because of their actions.
And the money didn't really fix that.
Right. It didn't bring back the lives lost.
Or heal the people struggling with addiction.
It's a tough question, whether money can ever really be justice.
Did anyone speak out against this?
Oh, yeah. A lot of people were upset.
Especially those affected by the crisis.
They felt like Purdue got away with it.
That the settlements weren't enough?
Not even close.
What about the Sackler family? They made a fortune off OxyContin.
They did?
Did they face any consequences?
That's one of the most controversial parts of this whole story.
How did they avoid it?
They were very careful.
Oh.
They said they were ethical and responsible.
Yeah.
They blamed other people in the company.
Wow.
And their lawyers were really good.
So they protected the family.
From illegal stuff.
But the public knew?
Oh, yeah.
The Sackler name became a symbol?
Of greed and the opioid crisis.
Did that lead to anything?
People were outraged. Activists and families of victims wanted justice. They wanted the Sacklers held personally accountable.
So did anything happen?
It took a while.
Okay.
But eventually, yeah.
What happened?
Museums and other places started to distance themselves.
From the Sacklers?
Yeah. They didn't want their money anymore.
Their name was taken off buildings.
It became a symbol of putting profit before people.
It shows that even with all that money and power,
yeah,
you can't always hide from your actions.
Nope.
But even though Purdue and the Sacklers face some consequences, the opioid epidemic is still going on.
It is.
What are your final thoughts on all this?
The OxyContin story is a really powerful example.
Of what?
Of how much power the pharmaceutical industry has.
Okay.
And how complex pain management is.
Yeah.
And the terrible effects of addiction.
It's a reminder that companies need to be held accountable.
Absolutely.
And that we need more transparency in healthcare.
And ethical consideration.
Then we need to listen to people like Dr. Van Zee.
Who saw the problem early on.
If only we had listened.
Things might have been different.
The OxyContin story is a warning.
A cautionary tale.
About corporate greed and the influence of money.
And the responsibility we all have to protect each other.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you learned something.
And that it encourages you to keep learning about this.
And to find solutions to the opioid crisis.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening.